Good morning, everyone. I'd like to call this meeting of the Senate Finance Committee to order. Today is Wednesday, January 9th, 2025. I want to thank Senator Marty for his partnership in developing today's agenda. And I'll maybe start off with how I presented this idea to Senator Marty about a week and a half ago. Back in 2008, during the banking and financial crisis, there was a lot of emphasis and attention paid to financial controls and risk management controls within the banking system. The OCC really took a deep dive into how the bank managed its risk exposure and how we manage the losses and the financial transactions that we went through. And state government has had, some fraud for a while, but it certainly seems that the frequency and the amount, the sheer impact of the fraud is higher today than I can recall. And we have our legislative auditor that works on our behalf as a legislature to look at these things. She issues several reports a year. We also will have the Minnesota Management and Budget here to talk about their role in financial controls and preventing fraud. And members, I hope we'll have a robust discussion. I'll be chairing the committee while the OLA is presenting, and then Senator Marty will take over when MMB is at the dais. Senator Marty, anything to add to that? So with that, welcome, Ms. Randall, and please feel free to begin when you're ready.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and members. For the record, my name is Judy Randall, Legislative Auditor, and I really want to thank the committee for inviting us here to talk about internal controls. As I said to the chair, it's not usually something people want to talk a lot about. We usually don't have hearings on internal controls, but as the Office of the Legislative Auditor, it's something we talk about a lot and think about a lot. So really appreciate the opportunity and looking forward to a good dialogue. Let me these are the things I want to cover today, just talking about internal controls, what they are. And then I'm going to turn it over to Ms. Rodriguez, Munson Rodriguez, who is our Deputy Legislative Auditor for our program evaluation side, to walk through a report we issued last week on implementation status of recommendations we've made in prior reports, and then kind of bring it back to what all of this means for you all in terms of providing legislative oversight. So let's just start first with internal controls. What are they, and why are we even talking about them? So for its internal control framework, Minnesota follows the internal controls put out by the Government Accountability Office, the GAO federally, and it's called the Green Book. That's kind of what it's called. And I'm just going to do some quotes here from the GAO to talk about what internal controls are. Internal controls help an entity run its operations efficiently and effectively, report reliable information about its operations, and comply with applicable laws and regulations. What I think internal controls are, just to put that into plain speak, is just the basic things we expect government agencies to do when they are overseeing and managing public funds. So you can see on the slide here, I've listed kind of the 5 key internal control activities. And if you look at them, I think you would all agree these seem like common sense. Establish responsibility, who is responsible for a given task. Implement separation of duties. Don't make one employee responsible for all parts of a process, right? Don't let them sign the check, approve the payment, receive the good, all of that. Let's separate that. And if you can't separate it among people, then have some compensating controls in place. Restrict access. Don't have one person have access to everything, the information systems and the banking system, everything. Let's split that up among people. Create policies and procedures. OLA lives in the world of policies and procedures, but this is standard stuff for a state agency. And then finally, establish record keeping, document expenditures and the justifications for them. So again, I would say these are all pretty common sense things. And yet, And when OLA goes into state agencies and conducts our performance audits on the financial audit side, we are auditing to make sure these internal controls are in place, that the controls are working well, and that agencies are complying. So now I'm going to walk through each one of those internal control activities and make a reference to a report that we have released in the last year that actually identified a problem with it, and talk about, well, so what, right? Why does it matter? So let's just start with the first one, establish responsibility. Why does this matter? Well, a month or two ago, we released a performance audit regarding DHS and its oversight of provider debt in Minnesota's Medicaid program. So this is, we're paying providers, sometimes there are overpayments, and sometimes we need to recoup those funds, right? It's a standard thing that happens in state government. Well, when we conducted this audit, what we learned is that nobody knew they were responsible for tracking those overpayments and working to recover them. Again, this is, I would say, a pretty fundamental aspect of government oversight. As a result, DHS wasn't aware of the issue until we started asking questions, and it turns out that the agency hadn't initiated recovery of over $40 million in overpayments. And not all of it, but some of it comes down to, the program group thought the finance group was doing it, and the finance group thought the program group was doing it. There were policies and procedures in place. There was not great record keeping, but there was record keeping, but ultimately nobody had responsibility. So again, basic internal control, this is why it matters. All right, let's go to the next one, separation of duties. Why does this one matter? Also in this past year, we issued a performance audit on the Minnesota State Academies for the Deaf and the Blind. And what we found in this case was that the superintendent approved his own travel per a policy. So there was a policy in place. But what happened is the superintendent, put in for some travel, some work-related, but then also some was personal vacation time, and got reimbursed for it. It wasn't a ton of money, but nonetheless, it was an improper use of money. And again, this was because there wasn't adequate separation of duties. I'm kind of zipping through these, but I'm just trying to make the point here of why each of these matter and making them a little tangible as opposed to just these kind of esoteric internal controls. So the next one, restrict access. Why does this matter? Well, we issued a recent performance audit on the Minnesota State Lottery, and we found that IT administrators had broad privileged access so that they could access all aspects of an IT system, both related to the game playing, and then also the way I think of this is they could go in and make a change and then delete the log that shows that they made a change, right? Now, we didn't necessarily see a problem, but it creates that risk, right, that somebody could do foul play. So again, this is why restricting access matters and making sure it relates also to the separation of duties. All right, create policies and procedures. Why does this matter? I mean, I can tell you as an auditor, it matters because it establishes criteria and expectations for how we expect staff to operate, and again, oversee the use of public funds and make sure they're getting used for the ways we intended. We released a report, I think now this one's maybe a year and a half ago, on the Minnesota Board of Firefighter Training and Education, and we found that there were no policies or procedures about verifying the purpose of mileage costs. So staff were going out, traveling around, and then they would submit their mileage for reimbursement, and there was no process for making sure that those miles were for business purposes. Again, we're not talking about a huge amount of money, but again, this creates the risk of a misuse of state funds. And then finally, we'll talk about established record keeping, why it matters. Again, as auditors, we're kind of all about documentation and record keeping, but it matters for beyond just conducting an audit. We did a performance audit on the Minnesota Board of Aging, looking at the senior nutrition program. And so this is a process where there's a lot of layers, DHS, Board on Aging, area agencies on aging, subcontractors, eventually delivering meals to seniors in their homes or in congregate settings. And what we found was there are 7 area agencies on aging. They each have established rates for the reimbursement. Well, one of those area agencies on aging, it's a mouthful, had a per meal rate that was 3 times higher than any of the other area agencies. And we asked, show us why it costs this much. and the Board of Aging couldn't show us, the Area Agency on Aging couldn't show us, and even the provider couldn't show us. There was no justification, no record keeping, no documentation for why their rate was the highest. And in fact, the Board on Aging said to us, we just want to make sure the meals get out. We're not worried about how much it costs, type of comment. So maybe it needs to be that high, but we don't know, right? Maybe the cost for that Area Agency on Aging were 3 times higher and it was justified, but without the record keeping to justify it, we don't know, and it creates a risk of unallowable or inappropriate expenses. Okay, Mr. Chair, so I've zipped through kind of like the 101 of internal controls, why they matter, and why I think they're important for the legislature to care about, right? Because this is all about how is our money being used, our money, the state's money, right, being used, and is it being used for the purposes that are intended. I'm now going to flip over and pass the baton to Ms. Judy Randall Rodriguez to talk through oversight that we provide after we issue a report. So we issue these reports, we make recommendations to the agency, we release them to you all, and then what happens? So thanks, Mr. Chair. I'm going to pass it to her. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Randall. Welcome to the committee. Ms. Rodriguez, please state your name for the record and begin when you're ready.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and members. For the record, my name is Judy Randall Rodriguez, and I'm the Deputy Legislative Auditor for OLA's Program Evaluation Division. As Ms. Randall noted, once we've done our audit or our evaluation work, we typically make recommendations to the state agency and often to the legislature as well. One of the ways that we try to follow up and determine what kind of work has been done to implement those recommendations is we do follow-ups. Now, this is something that we've been doing for years in the Program Evaluation Division. This year, we decided to expand to include our special reviews work. We also changed kind of the look of the product that we put out in hopes of it being a little bit more user-friendly. So you've got a copy of our follow-up to Program Evaluation and Special Reviews recommendations in front of you. I'm going to be directing your attention to a couple of things in there just to give you a little bit of an idea of what we've been doing with this product. Before I start talking about it, I do want to give you a little bit of an idea of how we create this. So every year we take a look at what are the projects that we have released recently that have recommendations to state agencies and the legislature. This year we looked back 3 years, so things that we released in 2022, 23, and 24. And then we work with the agencies. So this year, November, we sent written requests for information to the state agencies and asked them to provide us not only with narrative, but also documentation of any activities that they had taken to implement the recommendations that we had made. So we ended up gathering a lot of information, things like guidebooks, policies, procedures, training materials, website links, these types of things. Our staff takes a look at all of that information, and based on that information, we try to make an initial assessment of the extent to which an agency has or has not implemented recommendations. This usually ends up in some back and forth with the agency. We don't just kind of take it and move forward. There's oftentimes a lot of talking, emailing, kind of going back and forth so that we can make sure we get the information they need and that they can provide us with whatever information they have. Once we got all of that taken care of, we created the report. We went through a lot of internal rounds of review to ensure consistency, to ensure accuracy and objectivity. We also gave the agencies a chance to take a look at it before we released it to the public. Based on all of that work, you'll see on the front page of this document, we put the recommendations that we had released into one of 5 categories, kind of ranging from implemented to not applicable. So in some cases, we were able to, I don't want to say not a lot of effort, but without a great deal of work time, able to check documentation and determine that a recommendation was implemented. Those were usually things that were a little simpler, things like change a policy, create a procedure, things that we could check in a smaller amount of time, because we really were kind of pulling people off of their regular projects to do this. In other cases, we weren't able to make an initial assessment because the recommendation was so big, it would take an awful lot of work to dig in and even be able to make an initial assessment about where this was at. I want to note that in those places in this document where we have stated that we would need to do additional work to confirm, this isn't a reflection on the agency's work, It's simply a reflection on our lack of capacity at this time to do more work to determine and to really verify what has and hasn't been implemented. So now I'm just going to walk through a couple of examples with you. So one of the examples I want to bring your attention to is on page 2 of the document, if you want to take a look at it. This was looking at the Department of Commerce. As I noted, in some cases, recommendations were able to say that they are implemented. So at the bottom of this page, you'll see one of our recommendations was to adopt policies informed by the National Association of Insurance Commissioners. In this case, we were able to obtain those procedures, check them against the national standards, and determine if they had implemented that recommendation. But you'll see that there's another part of that recommendation that says to ensure investigators consistently follow these policies. Now, while Commerce was able to provide us with some information about training and other things they had done, in order to really determine whether that recommendation had been implemented, we need to dig into their files and their data and do more work than we really had the capacity to do. And that's why we noted that we would need to do additional work to confirm that status. I'll move on to just another example on page 12. We have some recommendations listed for the Metropolitan Council. In that case, you'll note towards the bottom of the page, or actually very bottom, we have one that has work needed to determine implementation. So in some cases, it wasn't as simple as creating a policy. Sometimes there were already standards, policies, other things in place, and we just found that they weren't being followed. So in this case, we found that there was a contract in place. The agency was only supposed to be paying trip providers if they met certain criteria. We found that they were providing bonuses when they weren't earned. So our recommendation was to provide them only when earned. Now, in order to make a determination as to whether this had been implemented, we would need to do a great deal of data analysis. And so at this point, we're not saying it's not implemented. We have seen that the agency has taken some steps, but we really can't even make an initial assessment at this point. So that's why it's in that category. And last, I'll just bring you to one more example. This is not implemented. So on page 29, this is in our assessment of the recommendations and the work that the legislature has done to implement recommendations that we've made. In the middle of the page, you see that we have recommendations from our report on oversight of state-funded grants to nonprofit organizations. So one of our recommendations in that report was that the legislature require grant managers to take specific training to understand their duties, and the legislature has not chosen to implement that recommendation as of yet. So just to conclude, I wanted to provide a little bit of overall information. We found that overall, state agencies had implemented or partially implemented close to 70% of our recommendations. That includes those recommendations where we would still need to do some additional work to confirm. And I just want to note that while we're presenting this graphic for some context, I also want to bring your attention to the fact that our recommendations are not all made equal. Some of them are fairly simple to implement. It could be adding something to an RFP template so that it's in line with state policy. But some are very complex. It might mean creating a whole new complaint system. So they necessarily will take some time to implement. So while we're providing this for your information, we think it could be helpful. I also want people to keep that in mind. And then I will just note that the legislature we found has implemented or partially implemented about 40% of our recommendations from our work that was put out in the last 3 years. And with that, I'm going to move the presentation back over to Ms. Randall. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So let's move now to legislative oversight. And one comment I do just want to make on showing recommendations that the legislature has not implemented, that was deliberate because you know why you haven't implemented some of them, right? There are recommendations you've thought about them or you haven't, and they're a priority or they're not, right? So there is judgment to be used in making those, in implementing those recommendations. And the same could be said for at least some of the recommendations we make to agencies. I mean, some of the recommendations we make to agencies, as Ms. Rodriguez said, are, comply with the law, have this in your form. But some are bigger and require thought, and an agency might not agree, and that's legitimate, right? That's a legitimate conversation for all of us to have, and it's especially a legitimate conversation for you all to have with that agency, and this is where the legislative oversight piece really comes in. So just, this is all pretty basic, but I just kind of want to talk about kind of the life cycle of our report and the information we provide to you and what you can do with it if you so choose. So we issue a whole bunch of reports, right? Some of them are program evaluations under Ms. Rodriguez. Some of them are financial audits and performance audits, and some are special reviews. We issue these reports based on nonpartisan, objective data analysis and work. And they have recommendations typically, for the agencies and also for the legislature. And then the agency takes those, they respond in the moment, sure, but they also then take those reports and hopefully think about them and implement, as you saw, a lot of the recommendations or make progress towards implementing them. Then what we're doing here with this follow-up work, and we're going to try to extend it a little bit into our performance audit work as well, is we're presenting this follow-up back to you to say, okay, here, it's been a year, it's been 2 years, it's been 3 years, here is what has happened. And now we're providing that information back to you all. And it's up to you on how you want to use it, right? You can say, hey, look, Commerce, great job, right? Or you can say, why hasn't this happened? Let's ask some questions. Or you can say, yep, we decided not to do that because we didn't agree, cross it off the list, right? But there's this circle of information that OLA can provide to you, and then you can use it how you want. The fact that we're having this hearing, I think, is amazing, honestly, because I think it gives you this information kind of in real time, not like, oh yeah, OLA issued that report 2 years ago, do I even know where I have it anymore? Oh, it got dusty. Oh, forget it, right? This kind of resurrects it a little bit, makes it relevant for you all, and then you can think about it and use it how you want. So that's what we're hoping to do. That's OLA's goal, is to provide information that's useful, accurate, objective, timely also, but useful is one of the pieces. And so thank you for the opportunity. And with that, we'll take questions.
Thank you, Ms. Randall. Any questions for the legislative auditor? So, Senator Prince.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. I just want to say, Ms. Randall, Ms. Munson Rodriguez, thank you. It's exactly the role of OLA. I was lucky enough to serve the first 4 years I was in the Senate. I just think you're putting out ideas for the agency, for the legislature, say, what do you guys think? I think it's incredibly valuable. I want to just say thanks and go back and tell everybody at OLA, hey, on the Finance Committee, they thought it was well done. So there.
Senator Westrom.
Mr. Chair, Auditor, I find it interesting the one department you brought up that had some issues you've highlighted. Just as an example, if anybody that watched Channel 5 investigative story last night, we've got another serious fraud issue with CCAP, it looks like, that hasn't ever been fixed. And so I'm just wondering if you've been alerted to that at all, and if there's anything your department can do. And I'm wondering if that maybe is tied to the commissioner recently resigning or retiring. But it looks to me, if that story's got any merit to it, there's some pretty damning facts going on again, and a lot of fraud that's still occurring under this department. And just wondering if you know anything about that, and any comments, and or maybe you'd have some work to do on it in the future.
Ms. Randall.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and Senator Westrom. Yes, we are aware of it and have been alerted, and I can't really get into the details more than that. Thanks.
Senator Dreier.
Thank you, Chair. Chairs, thanks for having this hearing. I appreciate it. And thank the OLA office for the work you guys do. Thank your staff. We really do appreciate it. And, you know, as we're facing this big deficit coming forward is part of the reason that a lot of us appreciate the work that your office does, because, you know, we can debate a program, and we do, and disagree, but once it passes, you know, we should do everything in our power to make sure it's done correctly and helping whatever group of people it was intended to help. And to that end, just kind of curious, what kind of feedback do you get, or do agencies come back to you asking the prodding questions on changes they made to try to do better? Is there much interaction with agencies kind of after the report is done? And I know it's a process, a lot of man hours to do it, but I was just curious what kind of dialogue traditionally happens after the fact.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and Senator Dreier. It's a great question. And I'll respond, and then I'll let Ms. Rodriguez respond. I would say it varies quite a bit. I have had commissioners come after a report has been released and set up private meetings with me and really get into the nitty-gritty. And they're very earnest about making changes. And then I have had others where, you know, we don't have that ongoing dialogue. Certainly when we start conducting this type of update work, it spurs some conversations. And so I'll let Ms. Rodriguez talk about that. But I would say every once in a while it happens spontaneously.
Follow up if I could, Chair.
Why don't we let Ms. Rodriguez answer, and then we'll do a
Perfect.
follow-up.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for the question. I would just echo what Ms. Randall said. I think that in particular when there are new people coming into positions, I hope and I think that oftentimes our reports can be helpful for them in looking at places where they may want to make changes. And that is oftentimes when we will have people reach out to us, ask for meetings, ask to have conversations. I think also this process that we use to follow up, and we do let them know at the beginning of every evaluation that we'll be following up in a year, we'll be following up in 2 years. And so I think some agencies more than others use that as an opportunity to really have conversation with us and a back and forth to say, okay, this is where we've been going, you know, what do you think about it? And so we welcome those types of conversations and are happy whenever they occur. Thank you.
Senator Dreier, follow-up?
Thank you. And then I'm one of those guys that put all your reports in a pile in my office, so I do have them, and I do go back to them once in a while. But you know, when the grant reporting report, I'll call it, you know, as a state, we've gone to more and more non-government agencies to do the work of the people, is how it's described to me. And I'm always concerned about the checks and balances on those grants. And I know your recommendation is that we need to get trained up on the staff that deals with that. Has any agency approached you about what training they should offer within their own agency through internal rulemaking, I'll call it, instead of having us come and mandate that they do it? You know, a lot of the agencies have really gone to rulemaking in the last 4 or 5 years instead of waiting for us to direct them. So I'm just curious if you've had any experience with that.
Ms. Rodriguez.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Senator. I have not had direct agencies come to ask about their own internal training, but I can tell you that the Office of Grants Management at the Department of Administration has been doing quite a bit of work in the last couple of years to beef up their training. I know that they have gotten a larger appropriation. They've been able to provide more staff. And so some of the things that we noted in our report, for example, they were only offering ad hoc training. Now they have it online all the time on demand. They're doing more in-person training. So I would note that kind of the Department of Administration as that keeper of the policies for grants management has kind of beefed up their role as well without the legislature directing it.
Chair, just to follow up to you, I guess, it'd be interesting to see if we could see what that is, what they are showing their agencies. So, thank you.
Thank you, Senator Dreier. We have Senator Daines and then Senator Marty.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chair. And could you tell me what type of intervals you have when you put out these recommendations? How often do you check with them to see if they're being implemented? And what tools you have to encourage them, either the commissioner or the agencies, to implement these recommendations?
Ms. Rodriguez.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Senator. We have typically in the past gone back for 2 years. So usually we will release our reports in February and we'll come back to them December of that same year. And then we'll come back the following December of the following year. This year we lengthened that to 3 years, just because, as I noted, some of our recommendations are big, they're complex, and they may take time. So this year it has been 3 years, but typically we've done 2. And I think I will punt over to Ms. Randall for the other part.
Ms. Randall.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and Senator Daines. In terms of enforcement or, helping, requiring our recommendations to be implemented, we do not have enforcement mechanisms. Really, the enforcement mechanism is you all. We provide information to you, and then it is up to you on how you want to use that by having hearings, asking questions, privately, in a hearing, and then using that information how you see fit. So our role stops at providing the information.
Thank you.
Senator Marty.
Thank you. And on Senator Daines' thing about your slide, but the legislative over the circle of you make the report, the agency responds, and we follow up, and then the one showing the legislature's got the most not implemented, which may be by choice, maybe because of everything else in the political world that makes it hard to follow up on some, but I do think that's important follow-up. I'm wondering, you had mentioned earlier when you were talking like during the lottery when you mentioned you didn't find foul play, but the risk of it's there and it needs to be addressed. And I guess I also heard you say lack of capacity to follow up on some of these things, and I think the same is probably true of the agencies as well. And I guess I had a question about types of fraud and types of waste, whatever, and the capacity to deal with and the cost-benefit analysis of that. And the example I'll give is in our Department of Revenue and the federal IRS. I keep hearing, 10 years ago, I think I heard that our Department of Revenue, if we gave them more auditors, they could bring in, it was a moneymaker. You bring in that, you stop fraud against them. And they said it could be 8 to 1 or something. And they say now, I think we're much closer to having enough in Department of Revenue. At the federal level, I hear IRS is way down and Congress wants to cut it further, which means that more fraud can occur. I'm wondering in terms of overall, your staff, you're saying that you need more capacity to file more. I assume MMB and others would have the same thing. Is there a different cost-benefit analysis you make based on types of things like the lottery one where there's risk of foul play, there's no evidence of it? If we beef up the number of auditors in your office, MMB and state agencies, and so we could undoubtedly catch more, how do we figure that out? How much more does it cost to find out how much more? And I assume some types of fraud type of thing you have to, if you don't respond to them, it's going to grow because people take advantage of it. But is there a different, how do you figure out the cost benefit thing on what we should be doing either in your office or the state agencies and so on?
Ms. Randall.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and Chair Marty. It's a great question, and I don't have an easy answer. So that's the short answer. The long answer is the best way to save money on fraud, waste, and abuse is implementing internal controls. I mean, it all really comes back to that. And so prevention is cheapest and it's the most effective. If fraud has happened, that money is out the door. And the ability to recover it is very difficult. It's very low ability to recover it, and it's hard to find it, honestly. And so the best thing to do is to make it really, really hard up front for it to not happen. Now, are we ever going to get to 0% fraud? No, we won't, unfortunately. But you know, if agencies from the beginning are implementing the policies, following the internal control requirements up front, not only does it prevent a lot of it, it also sends a message to people who are interested in doing it to say, don't mess, right? We're dotting our I's, we're crossing our T's, and we're probably going to catch you or stop it. And so, honestly, strengthening agencies' ability to implement what's already in place, I think, is the most fiscally responsible way to attack this problem.
Thank you. And Mr. Chair, related to that, I think we've been trying in the last couple of years to, I mean, you have us down as legislature 60% not implemented. And again, that's, those percentages and everything's hard to figure out, but I think some of the things like you mentioned with grant management that I think I'm glad to hear you say that admin seems to be moving forward on that, because I think the legislature said we've got to do more and put efforts in. I agree with you. I mean, having the right internal controls is key to making it happen. I just wondered, because it is, at a certain point, you get to a point where you're going to spend $2 to prevent $1 of waste or whatever. And I understand that the Board of Aging, I guess you said it was, that they were, that one of the feeding programs was 3 times as much for Meals on Wheels and so on. Those kind of things, if you have the controls, maybe you'll help, I don't know, but I just wanted to get a sense of that. So are you feeling the state is way behind in this, or we're not, you're obviously not saying we're where you'd like us to be, but where would you go?
Ms. Randall.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and Mr. Chair. You know, I'm not sure that I want to really opine on that here. I do think that we have work to do as a state. And I have said things before, you know, strengthening internal controls, prioritizing internal controls, right? And so one way is by you all having this hearing, right? I mean, again, nobody talks about internal controls. And so for you all to say, hey, this matters, we care about it, that's important. I think for everybody in an agency, you know, whatever agency, whether it's a small board or a big agency, to be like, this matters. And I guess one thing I want to lean into on that is internal controls help a program serve the people it's intended to serve, because you're protecting that money and making sure it's going to the right place for the people who need it. And so I view internal controls and oversight and regulation, which people don't love to do, as part of strengthening a program and the mission of a program. And so I think really having that conversation enterprise-wide, within agencies, within divisions, at the legislature, about how internal controls reinforce a program's purpose and mission, and that you can be for serving people while also making sure the money is going to the right place. I think those are compatible and like necessary for each other. You know, in terms of where to spend money and what type of structure, I don't think I should comment on that here today. I would just say I don't know that a lot more laws are required are needed to require agencies to do these things. These are already in place. You know, these internal controls, there's policies. You know, MNB will get up here and talk. They have policies. There's laws about grants management. These things are already all in place. It's a matter of everybody doing them.
And Mr. Chair, also, I mean, related to that, not just doing them, but having the capacity to do them, which you mentioned, and I think they'll mention, and everything else. Because, yeah, I think, as you said, the more we have stronger control, when you said there aren't many hearings on this, because it's boring. It's important, but very boring. People like to see what's happening, and yet the nitty-gritty behind the scenes, make sure it's done right, is hard. But no, I think you're right. I'm not saying there need to be more laws. I'm saying that is the capacity there, and you're saying unclear. Okay.
Senator Dreier.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Senator Marty, for your questions and comments on that. And I guess I'm kind of going back to your statement about the fraud that wasn't clawed back and the miscommunication. And as we all know, communication is key in 99% of our life with anything and everything. And you know, I've noticed a change in state agencies in just the short, this is the beginning of my 9th year here in St. Paul, which is scary to say. The communication from the agencies back to us is definitely taking longer than it used to get back to us. And, you know, I wonder if that's happening within agencies also. And then, of course, my mind goes right to, are they working in the same office? Are they in the same building? Or is part of this explosion of fraud maybe slightly correlated with working from home and not having that communication that I think we run, you know, when we run into each other in the hallways and talk to each other about a bill, that helps the communication within our caucuses. And have you seen anything or heard anything that would help us understand what I think is a lack of communication in departments?
Whoever wants to answer it.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, Senator Dreier.
And no comment would be okay.
Yeah, okay. I will just say that we saw problems regarding communication within agencies prior to 2020.
You know, Ms. Randall, one of the interesting points of this is it's one thing to have the controls. It's the other thing to have, I think you mentioned, the enforcement of the controls. And how do we ensure that that enforcement is happening? You know, I think back to the frontline worker pay audit where we had the policies in place and yet we allowed applications with fraud indicators to be approved. Department of Revenue didn't do the verification they needed to do. Help me understand, right? Do we have enough visibility? Do we have management of the agencies putting the proper focus on these controls? You know, when I was managing teams, it was always, you know, we got the results from what we measured and what we told our people was important. And what are you seeing in that space?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I think it's a great question. I do think more emphasis could be put on internal controls throughout the enterprise. And I think I keep saying this, but I think one of the best ways to do it is to have this type of hearing, right? To show that this matters to all of you and that you think it's important as a means to help ensure the state is getting what it was intending to get from the programs. So I do think the conversation has turned in the last, 6 months probably in terms of really having this be a bigger emphasis enterprise-wide. I do think having our update reports and having you look at them and hear them, I think is an important oversight mechanism. At the end of the day, enforcement in state government comes, from the power of the purse, right? And then the leadership in the agencies. And so I think those things have to complement each other and work together.
And Ms. Randall, just in your opinion, help me understand why agencies aren't implementing so many of your recommendations. Because when I look at, what MMB is reporting as far as resolved and what you're reporting is resolved, there's a little bit of a discrepancy.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So a couple of comments. One thing I'll note and reiterate what Ms. Rodriguez said is that our report is on the program evaluations, which sometimes are bigger, more thought piece types of recommendations. So, and MMB's has everything, including more of the performance audit recommendations, which are a little more compliance focused and easier to confirm. So we used the legislature as the example of not implemented intentionally, right? Not to call you all out on it, but mostly to not point a finger at any one agency, right? But also for you all to reflect and be like, well, yeah, sometimes we don't agree with that recommendation, right? Or we have a different idea, or that's not what we want to do right now. That's not our priority. And I think the same calculus can happen in agencies. Now, again, if it's a compliance issue, no, right? But if it's we think this would help improve the outcome, we think this would make your process work better, they might say, well, we disagree. And that's okay, and that's an opportunity for dialogue. So disagreement, hard to implement, it might take a couple years. And then you get into things like there might not be the will, and there might not be the resources, and that's going to get down to a case-by-case basis. So I think those are the variety of reasons why I think things don't get implemented.
Well, and I'll just say, and I think Senator Marty touched on it a little bit, is lack of communication even within the legislature, right? Who's accountable? Is it the Legislative Audit Commission? Is it State Government Committee? Is it us, quite honestly? Or is it the individual committees that should be taking that responsibility? And I think it's a tough decision that we in the legislature should have to do a better job of supporting your efforts. I just look at some of the recommendations. They seem extremely easy to implement. I know the governor has proposed a fraud reduction program that spends millions of dollars, and in some cases it's just a matter of paying attention to the details. It's a matter of common sense. And maybe we don't need millions of dollars spent to combat fraud. Maybe we just need our commissioners and their managers to take this seriously and really look at their processes critically. I mean, the role of a manager, I always think there's two roles of a manager. One is to remove the hurdles so that your staff can do the jobs that they want to do, and two is to constantly look for continuous improvement. And I don't know that we're there. I don't know that we've got the structure or it's being implemented in the right way to make sure that that happens. And I guess I'm more opining than asking a question, so I'll see if any other members have any questions. Senator Murphy.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and perhaps not a question as much as a follow-up, especially as I had been the chair of State Gov back in 2023 when we did work to put in new measures on fraud and prevention. And I have been thinking a lot about this question and, I think universal rejection of those who would want to steal from the public coffers. I don't think any of us want that. And it would be probably another hearing to try and dig in to understand why. Why is that happening now? But that is not the question before us. A lot of our focus has been on grants, and I think a lot about the enterprise of government and the work that we have in front of us, because while we understand that we appropriate money for a budget, a lot of the implementation of that budget happens through the private sector. It might be through grants, it might be through corporate interests, it might be through our hospitals and our schools and our sports facilities, et cetera. And so the idea of our ability to assess that and make sure that we're doing all that we can do to prevent, which is why I like the internal control portion of this. But the question before us, I think, is very significant when we think about the ways in which the dollars that we appropriate are then implemented through all sorts of the parts of the state's economy, the state's business sector, and the nonprofit sector. And I just want to make sure as we're having this conversation, I appreciate the hearing, that we are thinking broadly about the questions that we're asking and their impact on communities across the state, the ways in which we have chosen to engage in private-public partnerships to deliver the services that we believe are important and put our budget behind.
Thank you. Senator Murphy, and maybe to that, I spent almost 10 years in fraud and fraud prevention in the financial services world. And I really liked what Ms. Randall said, that it's always easier and more cost-effective to prevent fraud than it is to try to find it and recoup it on the back end. And most of my work in fraud prevention was exactly that, preventing the fraud. What we're finding, as Senator Westrom brought up, CCAP is not necessarily the failure of a nonprofit, it's the failure of our agencies to validate that that's happening. It's on the frontline worker pay. When when I had proposed numerous fraud prevention criteria to ensure that the right frontline people got the money that we wanted them to, it was rejected by the Department of Labor. And it failed on a party line vote. And now I'm seeing it in an OLA report, exactly what we were trying to prevent. So I think there's one thing to say that we do rely on these private partnerships, but we have to do a better job of identifying those partners. We have to do a better job of looking at the indicators that are there. Should the Department of Labor have approved applications with fraud indicators on them, or should they have taken them to the next step? That's the piece that I'm looking at. That's the piece of enforcement. That's the piece of management that we have to be looking at. And the OLA can find these, and we can pass a law, but how do we know that it's going to be implemented and it's going to be effective? And that's where that conversation comes in. And I didn't mean to cast aspersion on the state government committee, but to say that, it could be the Legislative Audit Commission, it could be this body that should be looking at those financial controls and taking that responsibility. So, or maybe it's the individual committees. It could be Commerce, it could be, HHS or whoever. So, and I think there's a little bit of that miscommunication, a little bit of not knowing who's accountable when these reports come out, and I think that's a conversation that our leadership teams need to have. Do we have any other questions for the legislative auditor? Okay, well, Ms. Randall, stick around. There might be some additional questions, and with that, I'm going to turn the gavel over to Senator Marty, and we'll hear from MMB.
Thank you, Auditor. MMB, welcome to the committee. Commissioner Campbell, Deputy Commissioner Reitan. Thank you. Go ahead, Commissioner, whichever one wants to start.
All right. Well, good morning, Mr. Chair. I am Erin Campbell. I am the Commissioner at Minnesota Management and Budget. And today we're here to present an overview of the work of MMB's Internal Controls and Accountability Unit. This testimony summarizes key highlights of our recent activities and strategies, promoting systems that safeguard public assets, and fostering a culture of compliance across the executive branch of state government. To start, I just want to acknowledge our appreciation of the work and partnership with Auditor Randall and her entire team at the OLA. Today's hearing serves as a great example of our interrelated work to create a culture of accountability across state government and to reduce risks and improve the internal controls environment in the executive branch. We're really appreciative of our ability to work so closely with her. As you all know, the state of Minnesota provides critical services every day for the security, benefit, and protection of Minnesotans. As the financial stewards of these public funds, we take fraud, waste, and abuse very seriously and are committed to safeguarding public funds. We're actively working with state agencies and the OLA to reduce the risk of state funds being misused. You'll hear shortly about our advances with our agency partners and the resolution of OLA findings. I'm also pleased to share that since 2020, the number of internal auditors across state government, internal auditors and internal control professionals across the executive branch is up considerably. We've gone from 42 to 82. From M&B, you'll also hear about our recent improvements to the risk assessment plans that helps agencies document the implementation of risk mitigation projects, as well as our revamped community of practice to bring together internal audit directors and managers throughout state government to coordinate efforts, improve internal control audit processes, share best practices, and provide a forum for training and idea sharing. Finally, just want to acknowledge that state employees play a crucial role in preventing and combating fraud, waste, and abuse. We work to ensure employees have the skills and knowledge to identify, report, and solve potential problems in order to earn and maintain the trust and confidence of our fellow Minnesotans. The Internal Controls and Accountability Unit serves as a resource for the executive branch, offering leadership and tools to help agencies strengthen their internal controls, minimize risks, and enhance operational efficiency. We're guided by the U.S. Government Accountability Office Green Book Framework, as the OLA mentioned, as a framework for effective internal controls. The Internal Controls and Accountability Unit works with state agencies to evaluate and build the framework for safeguarding public resources, mitigating risks, and promoting compliance with applicable statutes and policies. The mission of this team is to promote a robust internal controls environment across state government, achieving long-term success through collaboration, continuous improvement, and strategic initiatives. And with that, I'm going to turn this over to my colleague, Deputy Commissioner Rayton.
Welcome to the committee.
Good morning, Mr. Chair. My name is Britta Rayton. I'm MMB's Deputy Commissioner over our internal operations as well as our enterprise financial functions. The internal control and accountability units work is driven by 4 primary strategies, which are listed on the slide here, and we'll discuss those in more detail on the following slide. To start off, I just want to acknowledge it's a relatively small team, the internal controls team. We have 5 internal controls staff on that team that are serving the executive branch agencies throughout the enterprise. And 1 director of that unit. So it's a relatively small team taking on this work, but we do have a number of things underway to try to improve that culture of compliance in the internal control environment across the enterprise. So I'm going to dive into each strategy. So our first strategy is driving continuous improvement through enterprise initiatives. And one of the tools we have in this space is something called the Control Systems Assessment Tool. We refer to it in shorthand as the CSAT, so I will be talking about the CSAT this morning. But this is a pivotal resource aligning with the U.S. Government Accountability Office Green Book Framework and focusing on 15 organizational goals across 5 key components of internal controls. So agencies use this tool to evaluate their compliance, document their strengths, as well as their weaknesses, and monitor progress on their own corrective action plans. Subject matter experts and agency management collaborate to strengthen the internal controls, ensuring alignment with strategic objectives and fostering operational effectiveness through this tool. So the CSAT, or the Control Systems Assessment Tool, is a structured way for agency heads and managers to annually review and document the effectiveness of their internal controls in many important areas common to all agencies. They're periodically assessing internal controls to help identify areas of strength as well as areas for improvement. The CSAT lists 15 organizational goals and then has a series of recommended control requirements in all the Green Book components of the control environment, risk assessment, control activities, information and communication, and monitoring. So I just want to highlight some of the key areas of this CSAT tool that agencies are asked questions about. They include budget monitoring activities, payroll processing, revenue receipt and expenditure processing practices, contracting and grant-making processes and practices, continuity of operations plans, hiring practices, as well as accessible communication practices. So agencies are using this tool to determine if their internal control system conforms with the required statutes and policies in state government. Additionally, they are able to evaluate their operations on a series of statewide internal control goals and requirements. They can describe their own process and key internal controls, as well as identify action items for areas that need improvement, and then assign responsible parties and target completion dates for all of those action items. I also want to call out that this control systems assessment is then certified by the agency head. So the agency head is signing the certification form to document that they understand that they are responsible for their agency system of internal controls and that they are complying with our internal controls statutes. The agency head is acknowledging that they've reviewed the completed assessment and also the risk assessment that comes along with it, and that the agency's internal controls are meeting standards and policies and procedures established by MMB. Additionally, any agency that has an oversight board, a council, a commission, or a committee must have the head of that oversight board or board designee review the completed certification documents and sign the certification. So over the past 2 years, we have achieved 100% compliance in agencies going through this process within their agency and sending a certification into MNB. In addition to this tool, the agencies also complete a risk assessment on an annual basis. And just recently, we updated this risk assessment tool to enhance its usability and effectiveness. And this tool is really helping agencies identify, prioritize, and mitigate risks, and then track their progress on projects. Some of the examples of projects agencies have planned include changes to their IT system access and security, as well as role validation within their systems, updating and testing disaster recovery, as well as continuity of operations planning. Each year, we have 39 agencies do this deeper dive risk assessment, and we determine what agencies will do that based on whether they're a cabinet agency, whether they have a particularly large budget, or if they're performing functions that we at MMB think are have more inherent risk. In 2024, agencies identified 182 active risk mitigation projects. And in 2023, they identified 123 for a total of 305 projects in this reporting period. Key focus areas for agencies included cybersecurity, data management, and grants management. Again, so this agency risk assessment plan is a template that allows agency personnel to plan and document agency risk assessment, and then also to have their agency senior leadership involved in reviewing that risk assessment. And certifying that the agency's senior leader is then responsible to see those projects through. So quality documentation from all levels of the agency is really vital in the process to facilitate decision-making and resource allocation, and to develop and update that plan each year. So I'm going to go to our next strategy here. And our next strategy is monitoring the audit reports that are distributed through the Office of the Legislative Auditor. So our team works with agencies to help them develop and implement corrective action plans to resolve findings efficiently and effectively. And additionally, our internal controls team tracks resolution of the status of audit findings and recommendations through a document we call the Corrective Action Plan Status Update. This information is requested from agencies twice a year. So we send out to agencies all of their, what we consider to be open findings twice a year, excuse me, and ask them to submit to us where they are at in terms of resolving those findings. The Internal Controls and Accountability team is also available to provide consultation to agencies if they need advice, suggestions for how to address an internal controls gap. So the Internal Controls and Accountability team reviews those OLA audit reports, tracks the audit findings and recommendations, and then sends those corrective action plan status update reports to agencies twice a year. MMB did just release a report updating on agencies' self-attested a resolution of findings. That's up on the screen in front of you now. We did show that 66% of open findings were reported by agencies as fully resolved, and 30% were reported as partially resolved. This is for reports issued up until November of 2024. So some of the more recent reports are not included in these numbers, just to be clear. I also want to call out, and the the legislative auditor, brought this up. We are tracking a broader set of findings released by the OLA. The OLA's report was focusing on their program evaluations and special reviews. That is a smaller subset of the work produced by the OLA. We are asking agencies to attest to us where they are at resolution in the financial audits as well. That's a much larger universe of audit findings. And as the legislative auditor mentioned, in many of those cases, it's more of a yes or no, we've implemented this control. It's a little less complicated than some of the recommendations that come out in program evaluations. Turning to the next slide, this is looking at just the financial audit findings over time. So this is not including program evaluation or special reviews. That's because we wanted to show time series data going back historically. And before 2020, our team did not track the resolution on program evaluation and special reviews. But what this slide does show you is that we have over time improved with our agencies the percentage of resolved or partially resolved audit findings since we began tracking this data at about 2015. So I just want to call out that the Internal Controls and Accountability Unit has also introduced a standard response template for the OLA audit reports. This is helpful in terms of improving the consistency in tracking finding resolution status and the corrective action plans. The standard template asks agencies to name the individual responsible for the corrective action and the date by which they anticipate that corrective action will be complete. And so as you see the response letters coming back from agencies since we implemented this standardized template last fall, there's those standard data elements to help us track who's responsible and the timeline for implementation. As I mentioned earlier, the unit collects updates from agencies twice per year on their progress towards resolving the findings. And then within our available resources, and again, there's just 5 internal control specialists on the team, our team provides consultation to help resolve audit findings if agencies need that assistance. So turning to our third strategy, which is developing skilled professionals. To better foster collaboration and knowledge sharing, the Internal Control and Accountability Unit rebranded our Internal Control Roundtable to the Internal Control and Accountability Network. We call it ICANN, when we did that rebranding in 2024. This expanded community of practice brings together internal auditors and internal control professionals from across state government to discuss best practices, share their insights, and collaborate on enterprise-wide initiatives. So regular ICANN meetings feature keynote presentations, agency-led discussions, and collaborative workshops on topics such as continuity of operations planning, fraud prevention, project management fundamentals, and internal audit excellence. Presenters from other agencies sometimes come, including Department of Revenue, MNsure, the Bureau of Criminal Apprehension, and share their own valuable insights, enhancing the internal control ecosystem statewide. So moving to our fourth strategy, our final strategy is providing training and assistance across the enterprise. The Internal Control and Accountability Unit is committed to empowering agency personnel with the tools and knowledge needed to strengthen internal controls across state government. Our training and outreach efforts have reached thousands of employees and leaders across the state. So the unit regularly presents at the internal control concepts in our supervisory and manager core programs. So all supervisors and managers, as they come into those positions in state government, are required to take supervisor and manager core, and the internal controls staff does present there on the basics of internal controls. So during the 23-24 timeframe, we trained 856 supervisors and 418 managers on internal controls. This class also has an overview of fraud theory, very similar to what the legislative auditor was talking about, that the way to prevent fraud is to prevent the opportunity for fraud, and that's where we have impact. So what managers can do to prevent that opportunity from occurring, and also how they plan to respond if it does happen. The information is presented to them in multiple ways, including case studies, real-world examples of where internal controls have broken down, as well as a quiz game at the end to engage and make sure they've kind of learned and retained information. Additionally, I want to call out that state agency employees are required to complete an annual Code of Ethical Conduct training, reinforcing ethical standards as well as fraud prevention. This is part of a series of trainings that are required for all state employees annually. The Code of Ethical Conduct training is administered to all employees and focuses on some key topics, including acceptance of gifts, the use of confidential information, the use of state time and property, conflict of interest laws, non-retaliation laws, as well as the basics of internal controls. Additionally, our Internal Controls and Accountability Unit leads an annual Fraud Awareness and Prevention Week that is enterprise-wide and promoted across state government. The 2024 Fraud Awareness and Prevention Week was the largest one that they have pulled together as a team, featuring collaborations with our Minute partners, our federal partners, as well as other state agencies. Presentations that were offered through webinars across state government included the Federal Government Accountability Office, demonstrating their fraud risk framework, and the Association of Certified Fraud Examiners presenting fraud awareness for government employees. We also provided daily fraud prevention content via email and focused an internal controls bulletin that went out across the enterprise on fraud awareness. So speaking of the Internal Controls Bulletin, over the past 2 years, the Internal Controls and Accountability Unit has published 24 one-page bulletins on topics like risk assessment, ethics, compensating controls, providing quick, actionable insights for agencies to improve their internal control environment and the culture of compliance. The bulletin is designed to present internal control information in a way that's easy for everyone to understand and apply to their job. I do want to call out as we get to the end here that the governor's budget recommendations does include a proposal for 3 additional staff for this Internal Controls and Accountability Unit. We are eager to add capacity to the unit, especially the opportunity that it presents to add more training and assistance with the goal of further building an improved culture of compliance across state agencies. So in conclusion, the Internal Control and Accountability Unit remains steadfast in its mission to strengthen internal controls and foster a culture of accountability across state government through strategic initiatives, collaborative networks, training, and a focus on continuous improvement. We work with state agencies to safeguard public resources, mitigate risks, and uphold the trust of Minnesotans. Thank you for the opportunity to share this overview of the work that this team does, and I'm happy to answer any questions you may have.
Thank you. Commissioner, did you have a comment? No. Okay. Questions from the committee? Senator Dreier.
Thank you, Chair Marty, and thank you for the presentation, both of you. You know, looking at 16A and one of the sections, I think it's 12, talks about audit of states' use of federal funds, which is an annual report, is my understanding. You know, I didn't know we had an audit we had to do every year for state funds or federal funds, which is great. You know, my question, I guess, is, you know, a lot of the fraud that's been reported has been investigated by the FBI because of the federal funds. Was anything marked in those reports, in that audit? Was anything flagged or questioned? And was there any follow-up?
I don't have the full section of statute in front of me to make sure I'm speaking to the right section, but I think you're talking about the audit that's completed by an external auditor. We contract with the state auditor to do that work. There was items flagged, I don't remember them off the top of my head, for various agencies that manage federal funds. That audit is available publicly and produced by the Office of the State Auditor. There were follow-up conversations following that. That was about a year ago because it comes out in the springtime. So I don't have the details of that in front of me, but yes, there was follow-up conversations following that state auditor's report.
Commissioner Campbell.
Mr. Chair, Senator Dreier, an example of what was identified in that report was related to DEED's unemployment insurance division and missing tracking of some money that had come in, for example. So it was not identifying fraud. It was identifying more of the internal controls types issues that we've been talking about today.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you for your answers. I pivot a little bit here. I had a couple nonprofits in my office the other day, and they were concerned about the grant money that we had issued to them a couple years ago, and they hadn't received it. And it was a pretty straightforward program. And one of them, talking with the agency's staff, the staff told them that the department was having a liquidity issue. And that puzzled me. So is there any time a state agency in the last 5 years, let's say, or 4 years or 2 years, should have had a liquidity issue within a state agency here in Minnesota?
Mr. Chair, Senator Dreier, that's a really complicated question. We have hundreds of funds in state government, and so it would really need to know more about the specifics of the situation. I will say it surprises me because there are ways to manage that. So perhaps we could talk offline and get a little bit more information on what was happening there.
That would be wonderful. Thank you.
Senator Friends and Senator Pratt.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Commissioner. Thank you, Deputy Commissioner, Director Randall. This is all for all three of you. This is exactly what we should be doing. Appreciate it. It's not glamorous. Kind of nervous about telling my kids that I sat for an hour and a half for the internal control of agency review. But a couple points I would really like to share and hope for members this sounds like something both parties can agree on. We have to create a climate of accountability. We have to send a message to our coworkers, whether we love them or hate them, that it is our job to appropriate and oversee and to hold members of the agencies accountable when there's room for improvement. What you're doing here is fantastic to help all of us remember that it's our job to confirm commissioners and to ask tougher questions. And so I appreciate that. I also think there's a pride and attitude element that we should be continuing to work on. The people that work for our agencies are just as Minnesotan as the rest of us. They work just as hard. They love their kids just as much. We have to show by our example that when you have an attitude of accountability, when you treat the taxpayer dollar as something worth protecting, that it will lift the sense of pride in every single agency. I think that's a very worthy goal that will not only make it more fun to work at the agencies, more rewarding, but will help us tamp down on our concern here, which is waste and fraud. And then finally, Mr. Chair, co-chairs, we're looking for the sweet spot to Senator Marty's question about how much do we need to dig into the details, how many more FTEs to prevent this. I love the federal debate about the IRS. So if you'll give us $80 billion, we'll prevent $200 billion in tax fraud. That's the questions we should be asking. My 2 cents would be, we want to go to whatever level it is to properly use our resource to protect and then go a little farther If you ask me, the prevention here is one of the key financial lessons. And if we have to spend a few more bucks to prevent, I think that's money well spent, including the value in having Minnesotans sleep a little bit better at night, saying, yeah, they've got some auditing, they've got some fraud prevention, they've got some systems in place. So really appreciate, very valuable hearing to our co-chairs, whosever idea this was. This was a good one. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Francis. We have Senator Pratt and Senator Wickland.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And Mr. Chair, I'm going to have several questions, so if you want me to break it up and let others talk, I'm happy to do that too. Commissioner, we had just a brief conversation last night about statute 16A.057. And if you look at that statute, the very first sentence, the commissioner is responsible for the system of internal controls across the executive branch. It seems pretty straightforward. It lists out 3 duties to safeguard public funds. What caught my eye is ensure programs are administered in compliance with federal and state laws and rules, and require documentation of internal control procedures over financial management activities, provide analysis of risk, provide for periodic evaluation of control procedures to satisfy the commissioner that these procedures are adequately designed, properly implemented, and functioning effectively. And I get concerned with that as far as your role and responsibility. And as Ms. Rattan said, we rely on the commissioners to attest. But it seems to me that the law expects more than just an attestation. It expects some sort of management oversight to ensure that the attestation is correct. I think there's no better example of this than Human Services. We have about, if my calculation is right, we have about $500 million in outstanding fraud. And when I look at the Human Services report, and then again, the J. Cole story last night, there seems to be a continual breakdown of those financial controls and oversight. Now, I think a lot of that falls on the commissioner and her management and supervisory team. But in relation to 16A.057, it seems to point to your agency as well. Can you comment on that?
Commissioner.
Yep, Chair Marty, Senator Pratt. So the way that we effectuate the statute is as Britta indicated, so Deputy Commissioner Rayton indicated. So we have a team of 6 people who are responsible for this for the entire enterprise. And so what we are doing is creating systems, exactly as the statute says, they're creating systems to help agencies implement good internal controls, to do risk assessments on a regular basis. If you look at the, later in the statute, subdivision A talks about agency head responsibilities, where it's really the head of each executive agency responsible for designing, implementing, maintaining an effective internal control system within an agency. And so what I would say is, your point is well taken, and that would just require more people to be able to do what you're asking us to do, or to do what you're suggesting. We do not have the resources to dig into each agency's internal controls every year. That's just beyond our capacity at this time. And so I would tell you that I think we're open to that if that's the direction that the legislature would like to go. But we do, and not just in the internal controls area. This is true in other areas like HR and other areas of finance, where we set the parameters, the policies, the expectations for the enterprise, and then rely on agencies to implement those things.
Thank you. Mr. Chair and Commissioner, when I look at the Human Services OLA report, right before finding 1, Minnesota Management and Budget Policy states that state agencies are responsible for maintaining internal controls to ensure debt collection. The same policy also requires agencies to refer debt that is over 120 days past due to the Minnesota Department of Revenue. And yet their finding was that Human Services never attempted to recover about $40 million in outstanding overpayments to MA providers. So my question is, clearly the legislative auditors defined that you have a policy. How do you enforce that policy to ensure the agency does that?
Mr. Chair, Senator Pratt, so in that instance, I think that Commissioner Harpstead has testified to another Senate committee recently into the Legislative Audit Commission. It is not that they are not attempting to collect that debt or those overpayments. They are, there's a system in place where it's collected in the next payment. So if there's an overpayment or an underpayment, the next payment that goes to that provider, it is adjusted at that time. What ends up happening is that system doesn't work if a provider has gone out of business. And so in those instances, it ends up in this separate place. Now, what MMB does on an annual basis is an uncollected debt report, and that is submitted to the legislature, and you all have access to that. So we are reporting on that, but again, it would be up to an individual agency to follow their own policies and procedures in terms of actually making the attempts to collect that debt. One thing that you sort of talked about already here is that there's a point of diminishing returns, and it really, what I understand in the case of the Department of Human Services, they had a contractor who was doing this work who actually walked away from the contract because they weren't able to collect enough money to pay themselves. And so it is not that the agency is not doing this. It's not that the agency isn't taking this seriously. This is hard work to get this money back from businesses that don't exist anymore. Let me just check. Deputy Commissioner Rayton, would you add anything to that?
What I would add, Mr. Chair, is we are aware that there's improvements that can be made. I think the agency acknowledged that in their response letter to the audit, that there are recommendations that they are working to comply with. We're also discussing that at MMB. There was a meeting a couple weeks ago that included our financial reporting director, our accounting director, myself, and our internal controls director to talk about, how can we be helpful to DHS going forward in this space.
And Commissioner, I might just add, in the financial services realm, we will often employ collection agencies. We'll collect 50 to 70 cents on the dollar. When you're talking about $40 million, that's a significant amount of money. I'm also looking at finding 3 in that report. The Department of Human Services did not accurately report its accounts receivable balance to the Minnesota Management and Budget for inclusion in the state's financial statements since 2019. Now that seems like that should be a red flag for your agency to go in and maybe help prevent some of the fraud that we've seen over the last 6 years. Can you comment on that?
Sure, Mr. Chair, Senator Pratt, we are working on that with them right now. They do quarterly reporting, and it's my understanding, I think, on accounts receivable that, on accounts payable, that this has been resolved. We should see all of that resolved in January reporting, and that we're actively working with them on the accounts receivable side in particular around some of the uncollectible debt issues. And so Deputy Commissioner Rayton may know a little bit more about the specifics of those conversations.
Mr. Chair, I would just
Can you
add,
pull the microphone?
Oh, yes, of course. Senator Pratt, I would just add, that's why we're including our Director of Financial Reporting to make sure we are getting them the right information for how to make sure they are reporting accurately.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. But Commissioner, I'm concerned that over the last 6 years, we're finding out about it now in a 2024 audit rather than having, can you help me understand why your agency didn't respond to that more quickly? And it's not you, it's your predecessors as well, but it seems to be a systemic problem within the agency that we're not identifying or reacting to those red flags in a timely manner. And that's, I appreciate what you're looking at going forward, but help me understand the breakdown that led to that.
Chair Marty, Senator Pratt, what I would say is that we may just not catch all of that. We do rely on the finance professionals in state agencies. Certainly, the Department of Human Services has a robust finance department, and we are doing this work on behalf of all state agencies And relative to that, the team just does not have the capacity to verify, all of those numbers. We need to be able to trust that the agencies are providing us good information. Now, we absolutely agree. We want the right information from them. We are always available to work with them, to help them improve processes, to get to that point. But if we're unaware of the issue, that becomes a challenge for us. And so, again, we are interested in continuous improvement here. If there are ways that we can do that, that would be great. I do think it's probably a resource question.
Super.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And then just, we've talked specifically about the state academies audit, where there were several items specifically related to their oversight of their foundations that were just never implemented. There was never any follow-up. If we've got your team that's supposed to be tracking those recommendations or those follow-ups, can you tell me how that fell through the cracks?
Yeah, Mr. Chair, Senator Pratt, are you asking about recommendations from, maybe I missed part of this in your question. Are you asking about recommendations from previous audits that weren't updated?
Yes.
I think that's a good question. I don't know what the answer is to that. I do know that since then, the State Academies has completed many of the recommendations that were made in a report that came out in November. I think that they are well along the way here in completing those steps. I think that they have a few more to get to. Certainly it is the case that the policies that MMB has in terms of things like approving travel and reimbursement and all of those sort of things, those policies exist, and to the extent that they weren't being followed, again, it's if we're not aware of the specific circumstances, it can be hard to correct those things. We really need the executive director and the board at the state academies to be being really mindful of those things. What I will just add is that this is something that sometimes small boards and commissions really struggle with, is having the sophistication in their finance and HR offices. And we are actively talking about how we can better support that work, knowing that this is just a challenge. In some ways, the remoteness of the campus might contribute to that, just in terms of the community of practice and having established relationships with colleagues and other agencies. And so this is an area we really would like to try to find ways to help the state academies improve, both on the finance and on the HR side in this space, having some conversations with SMART at admin to see how we can provide better service to them.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I'll take a break here and let others ask questions.
Senator Wickland had a question.
Oh, thank you, Mr. Chair. Yeah, I wanted to go back to, I really appreciate your presentation and being able to hear kind of what your vision is for this internal control area, and especially going over all the different strategies that you have in place and you have been collecting data on over the years. So I really appreciate that. And also the copy of the report, the biennial report that we have in our packet today with, more details about that. And I wanted to ask about the strategy too about monitoring audit reports. It sounds like you have in place a way to track. You have in place a response template that does track all of the items that are coming from the whole array of reports that come in from the OLA, whether it's, the financial audits and internal control and the evaluations. And it seems like that is a great way to help us or help the agencies, strengthen their prevention response, which we are hearing from both you and from Ms. Randall, is really important if we want to be preventing additional cases of fraud or waste. And what I'm wondering is, since you have this and you have criteria for, what's resolved and what is partially resolved, unresolved, would there be any way that we could link back some of that work with what the OLA does to help us in the legislature have a better vision into, some of these updates? I like the special this evaluation and special review recommendation update guide. I appreciate that as someone who's been in the legislature a while now. It is helpful to have updates because I can remember when a report, was done and some of the things that came out, but how do we follow up on what's happened? But I'm wondering if there would be a way to I don't know, kind of better link what they're trying to do with updates with what you're doing, not only so that we have more visibility as a legislature, but we also have an understanding of, like you've discussed what the different terms mean in terms of implemented or partially implemented, or, so we have a common communication, method for the legislature to go back to both the OLA and agencies. If you could comment on that. Thank you.
Mr. Chair, Senator Wickland, so I'll take that sort of in two parts. The first is just acknowledging that there's distinctions between their report and our report. And one of the things that we were just talking to the legislative auditor on Monday evening, and as part of that conversation, indicated we really like the opportunity to sit with them and go through the recommendations and understand where the discrepancies are. At the end of the day, we want to be able to implement the OLA's recommendations. We know you rely on the OLA's feedback to trust that those things have been done, and so we'd like to understand where whatever we are hearing from agencies is distinct from their understanding of what's happening in an agency. And so we're looking forward to the opportunity to sit with them, go through those recommendations, and make sure that we can reconcile them and work with the agencies to get to at least a shared understanding of what is being reported in both of those places. I think the notion that we're both reporting and that we have slightly different content is something that is worthy of discussion between us and with the legislature this year. If there's a different and better way to do that, that better provides the legislature the information that you need in order to make decisions or interact with agencies, we're really open to what that would look like.
I will comment that both you and the legislative auditor talked about the importance of working together, and I think from our perspective, that would be very helpful for both of you to be working together so we know what the difference, when there's something that unimplemented or whatever, what's that mean and what the differences are and that sort of thing. Senator Wickland, you're done. If so, Senator Draheim, and I have Senator Pratt, but Senator Murphy before. Go ahead, Senator Draheim. I'm sorry.
Thank you, Chair. I wasn't sure which.
I'm sorry, I saw somebody else.
No, that's all right. So going back to 16A, and I think it's 6, budget for internal controls. I know we were just talking about that a little bit, but it says in there you may require each agency to spend a specific percentage on those internal controls. Have you or the governor asked the agencies to do that, to spend a percentage? And then my follow-up would be, what are those percentages?
Deputy Commissioner Rita, do you want to?
Deputy Commissioner, go ahead.
Senator Draheim, to my knowledge, we have not designated a specific percent historically that agencies must spend on internal controls. We certainly create expectations that they are implementing the policies and procedures and statute through our various tracking tools and the attestation that they're certifying that they're in compliance, but I'm not aware of ever, of MMB ever designating a specific percentage of budget.
Senator Dreier.
Thank you, Chair Marty. Do you know what percentage of your own agency you spend on those internal controls?
Senator Draheim, off the top of my head, I do not, but we could do some analysis.
Okay. Last, just how many employees are in MMB?
Senator Draheim, we have about 360 employees. We have a 5-person internal controls team with a Director of Internal Controls, but I do want to call out that because we do enterprise accounting and enterprise HR, there are individuals within those units that are also enforcing statewide policy and procedure in our day-to-day work. So I think we would have to do some discussion about which of those folks would we say are dedicated to the enforcement of internal controls. Certainly, we have a team of experts that can go out and give trainings and suggestions for improvements in internal controls, but a large portion of MMB's FTEs are dedicated to making sure agencies are completing their processes, such as financial reporting, their accounting work, in accordance with policy and procedure.
Just one final statement, if I could, Senator Marty. I guess, to me, that's good to hear. That's the way it should be across the whole state. And, it gets a little frustrating for me when, all day long we meet with groups that come into our office and have requests. A lot of good ideas to help their communities out. And of course, we can't fund all those. There's not enough resources to go around, so we have to prioritize. And, to me, to see a bunch of requests for more FTEs on something that should already be expected from our state agencies is frustrating to me, because that takes money out of our local communities. So I'm sorry to preach a little bit, Chair, but, I just think this should be a standard, and it starts at the top. It starts with the governor, and it starts with all the commissioners. So I think we need to change the culture, the corporate culture, if you will. And hopefully this is the start of that. So thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Senator Murphy.
I am looking at the report from the OLA and, reading through some of the places in which the legislature, has, according, per this, has not implemented. Worker misclassification is a newer area of law for the state of Minnesota. And there's a to-do list here for us that is not just passing the law, but, making sure that it is implemented. And over my years, have recognized the various ways in which we put into law a program, and then the expectation for the implementation. Senator Pratt brought up frontline worker pay. I've been involved in many examples. One of the things I think the legislature tends to do is to create a lot of checks or expectations for an individual or an entity who is going to receive state dollars in order to make sure that we are verifying, justifying, and making sure that the dollars are going to the right place. And when I think about the landscape across state government, the expectations are different in different places, which isn't simple. And sometimes I think the design of the laws that we put in place and the lack of simplification or the lack of standardization is another area or place that we should be looking if we want to prevent fraud. And I am wondering if you've considered or have any advice for us as legislators regarding that issue of simplification or the issue of modernization of the tools that the administration uses that would help us understand where we need to do a better job to prevent fraud.
Deputy Commissioner.
So, Mr. Chair, Senator Murphy, I don't have recommendations off the top of my head for streamlining and improving, but I do want to mention that there was language in 2023 about kind of a set aside on grants for administration of those grants, and I know that's an ongoing discussion. But I do think one of the issues is just making sure that when programs are established, we are acknowledging that there is a cost to the oversight of that program. I think that happens in some cases and not in others, and so I do think that is not consistent currently in terms of the approach to ensuring there is an appropriate level of staffing for the magnitude of dollars being spent.
Senator Pratt? No. Senator Murphy, I'm sorry.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Just one more then. I appreciate that. And you're right about our continued discussion about the administration of grants and the standardization of the funding, and I do think that's an issue that the State Government Committee is going to come back to this session. But, we're having, through the course of this conversation, a discussion about how we move forward, including what is the right level of resources that the administration needs and people to do the work, and I appreciate and hear that. And I also know when I read the news of this morning that the federal administration, the new president, is putting a freeze on a significant amount of state dollars to the tune of $1.9, I think, billion a month. That's going to court in a legal action, as I read from our congressional delegation. But it is a big red flag for me in terms of the work in front of us and the altered financial landscape we may find ourselves in because of the new administration in DC. And so as I am listening and we are talking about this important issue of fraud prevention, which I think is important because we want to make sure our public dollars are going where we want them to go. I think we all agree. I heard that loud and clear from the state auditor. But I do also want to flag that the financial landscape we face could be altered significantly by the folks in Washington, D.C., and not in a way that is in our control whatsoever, but we could be left with a hot pile of trouble that we have to reconcile. And I just want to put that on the record as well, because if the answer to this issue is more resources, then I think, that could be a real challenge for us. And I think that, and see people like Senator Gustafson working very hard on a proposal, and I know there is bipartisan support for more work to prevent fraud, and I think that is an important priority for the legislature, but I think we have to be eyes wide open about what we're facing.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Commissioner.
Chair Marty and Senator Murphy, I appreciate the comments on that, and we're certainly working through it. I would add that that there's sort of mass confusion in state agencies about this, and this is the type of thing that pulls distraction from the work that we're trying to do on a regular basis. So if you've got an agency's finance team that now needs to spend the next several days focused on trying to figure out how this impacts them, an agency's HR team trying to figure out which employees are paid for with federal funds, and is there an impact to their employment status? All of those sort of things is pulling focus from the things that are really important in terms of running state agencies. And so I would just acknowledge that this type of thing is problematic for a number of reasons in our perspective. And I would just, on your earlier question, just add that really appreciate that question. My general philosophy is that we should make it easy for people to do the right things, and we will spend some time thinking about what that might look like so we could work with you this session.
Senator Pratt.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chair. And Senator Murphy kind of touched on a little bit of it. When we talk about accountability, certainly in statute you have a large part of that, but also we have the Office of Grants Management. And can you tell me how, and one of the recommendations is that we pass legislation that the Office of Grants Management put all their employees through training, which to me seems like it should be done. It should be able to be done without a statute. It seems pretty common sense. But talk about your relationship and your oversight of the OGM, because it seems like a number of the problems that we are observing kind of maybe in some cases originate there. And as the executive branch is responsible for those controls, including OGM, how are you ensuring that they're doing their job correctly?
Commissioner.
Mr. Chair, Senator Pratt, the Department of Administration oversees the Office of Grants Management, and so they do a lot of that day-to-day work. We certainly work closely with them on a number of different things, including, just as a legislative auditor indicated, they've been making a lot of important strides in this space. One of them is in training. So they, I think it's operational in February. They've been working with our enterprise learning management, our enterprise talent development team, to pull together some additional training on this topic for people who work in grants management. And so that is underway.
Mr. Chair, I've got some other questions related to, some of the fraud management, fraud prevention pieces, the additional staffing that I think we can take offline. Just a couple of reactions, and I appreciate the robust discussion we've had. Senator Murphy talked about the executive order that was issued yesterday, and I think as I look at the executive order, and I've seen from the Obama administration to the Trump administration, typically we find some sort of edict come down, and a few days later we get the clarification. And I am absolutely convinced that we will see this issue clarified very, very quickly. As I think the administration said, we don't expect any interruption to those direct benefits that people expect to receive. But I think it's also a recognition by the federal government that we've got a fraud and waste problem as well, and that we need to rein that in. I appreciate what Senator Frentz said, and highlighting that our state employees take pride in their jobs, and I absolutely agree with that. I don't think anything nefarious is necessarily going on. What I see in the OLA reports are really two things. One, our employees aren't trained properly, and I think that's something that the legislature shouldn't have to impose. That should be something that, as part of that continuous improvement process, agencies should be able to enact, especially when we see these repeated breakdowns in how we manage the taxpayer money. And the second thing that always seems to kind of pop out to me is that we may have employees that want to do the right thing, and we don't empower them to do it. I mean, we can look at the Feeding Our Future report. We can look at the Human Services report. We can even look at the Frontline Worker Pay report, where we had those flags sitting there, and we didn't empower our people to do their jobs properly. And you want to talk about a morale killer? That's it, Senator Frentz, because they get frustrated by it as well. And I think, quite honestly, the governor has some blame here. There is a lack of accountability when we see these violations happen over and over and over. And the governor doesn't, until recently, the governor hasn't taken any stance on it. In fact, at times he's come out in opposition to some of the easy fraud prevention measures. And I think we should expect the governor and his senior staff to make this a higher priority. It's not just about spending money. It's not just about moving an investigative team from the Department of Commerce to the BCA. It might be additional staffing, and I'd like to see what those do, but it's also, as Senator Dreier said, it's a culture change. It's making sure that his commissioners, his appointees, know that this is important to him, and that their senior staff knows it's important to their commissioners. And I've not seen anyone held accountable for that. And so, Commissioner Campbell, I hope you'll take that message back to the governor as well, that I think, spending several $1 million may be helpful, but there's a lot we can do without spending any money, just by changing the culture and making sure that we have the easy things covered, the common sense things covered. They don't cost any additional money. Mr. Chair, I'm looking forward to working with you and maybe some others on the recommendations to the legislature. I'm kind of appalled at the poor job that we've done. And, you know, I think we have to have serious conversations about what we can do in order to improve our closure on these items as well. And thank you for co-chairing this and your partnership in putting this together.
Thank you. Commissioner, any last comments?
Mr. Chair, Senator Pratt, I would just acknowledge your point and just indicate that commissioners, the message has been delivered to commissioners. We are working on improving the culture of compliance in state agencies. An email to every employee from the state governor, every state employee from the governor went out to that effect, acknowledging that this is a crucial role that every employee plays, and that the onus is really on supervisors, managers, directors, leaders, and agencies to make sure that they are creating a culture of compliance, and one where an employee feels that they trust that when concern is brought forward, that it'll be taken seriously, and that there is not retaliation. To be clear, that would not be acceptable under existing state policy, but to really make sure that employees feel comfortable in that environment. And so I think there's more that we can do in this space. We're interested in pursuing that as well, and just want to acknowledge your point as well taken.
And I will thank both the auditor and MMB for being here today. And I think that there are a number of things you both have mentioned about how we want to make sure. I mean, I think in most cases there is a culture. We want to make sure we prevent this. And I think the auditor said, I think we all agree that money that isn't wisely spent takes away both public confidence and from the programs that need it and so on. And I think we all understand it very much. And I think most people in most areas of state government know that, but I think it's good that both auditor and MMB are focusing on making sure that everybody hears it. And again, a lot of these things that have been in process in terms of making sure there's training for supervisors and everyone and the policies are clear. I think you're on the right track, and I hope that the two offices can meet with each other. It helps us understand better what's going on when the two of you are on the same page a little more. So thank you all for your attention to this, and with that, no further business. This committee is adjourned.